We're now going to approach a topic that I've been leaving towards the end of the module. We started off saying that we were interested in the relationships between brains, behavior, and minds, brains, and behavior. That was what we said, wasn't it? And we've left the notion of behavior relatively informal so far. And trying to say exactly what behavior is actually very difficult. That is, what should we call behavior? Not all movements are to be interpreted as behavior. There's something about the way that we describe a behavior that seems to suggest it has a purpose. It has some intention behind it. When we observe people, we're observing movement of various kinds, and some of that movement might be interpreted as a behavior or not. So we're going to turn to the question of movement, and most of the behaviors that we are going to be interested in here that are directly and simply observable are fairly simple behaviors. We're going to be primarily concerned with locomotion, with getting around. We will not, when we deal with movement, we're not dealing with very complex socially determined behaviors like writing a novel or saying your prayers. We're dealing here with the coarsest kind of behaviors that have the strongest links to biology. And one of the things we're doing is we're asking, to what extent should we turn to the body to understand what's going on? Or should we understand things differently? So locomotion is a great example. Getting around is obviously a very, very important skill for every animal. We can learn a lot about about how we get around by studying the kind of bodies we have. If you have 2 legs, 4 legs, 8 legs, wings, it's going to really matter. And there it makes a great deal of sense to ask, well, what's the role that the brain plays in this? We have a better chance of answering that question than we do of answering the question, what's the role of the brain when you're writing a novel, for example? Because in writing a novel, we're dealing not only with the movements of the hands and the eyes, we're also dealing with thoughts, intentions, genres, social expectations, economic incentives, all kinds of things that are possibly not to be found in brains. We want to take a biological approach. We want to study those kinds of behaviors which are freely observable in the movement and which are probably shared with other animals. So it might seem like an odd question to ask, what does the brain do? But if we observe the brain, if we look at the brain, then we can only see a few things directly. We know that the brain has connections to the soup of chemicals in which the organs of the body swim. And this includes all the hormones and the neurotransmitters, and it includes self-regulation of the brain. The brain is an electrical chemical signaling system, and the production, consumption, and elimination of those chemicals is part of the task of the brain. So it's self-regulating. Other than that, the only thing that we can see when we look at the brain in its body-bound state is that it moves muscles. Now, moving muscles is a very simple kind of activity. And I want to distinguish between that kind of behavior that we're going to attribute to the brain and those more abstract things we've been talking about throughout this course, like thought or perception or reasoning. Trying to make a link between a lump of meat called the brain and thinking or perception or reason is extraordinarily difficult. So we're hoping to get a handle on things by coming through the theme of movement to some of the simplest kinds of behaviors. And we'll be getting away from a lot of the more abstract concerns, including language. Language is something that we infer from movement. So speech and writing and the signs in which we live among and so on, their link to movement is very indirect. When we start to think about movement as something rooted in a particular kind of biological body, we find that the basic principles of movement are actually held in common across all species. Movement entered into the evolutionary tree at a very, very early stage. Muscles and nervous systems came into being together in the very first animals that had them. Those were jellyfish, basically. And they've worked together ever since. In some respects, one of the main reasons we have nervous systems is to move. It's sort of the point at which nervous systems enter the picture is the point at which movement enters the picture. And movement is very important. Food is not evenly distributed in most environments. Resting is often a requirement. You need to rest somewhere safe. Even humans have that need. And of course, reproduction. There's a lesson to be learned about what role the nervous system plays in the simple body from the juvenile sea squirt, which Daniel Dennett describes thus. The juvenile sea squirt wanders through the sea searching for a suitable rock or hunk of coral to cling to and make its home for life. For this task, it has a rudimentary nervous system. When it finds its spot and takes root, it doesn't need its brain anymore, so it eats it. It's rather like getting tenure, he says. As he has tenure, he's qualified to speak on that subject. His description there is fanciful, a little fanciful. It's slightly inaccurate, but it's very close. The sea squirt, the animal in question, undergoes a metamorphosis, just as a caterpillar metamorphizes into a butterfly. And many, many animals go through different stages with a serious reorganization in the middle, called metamorphosis. This happens to the sea squirt as well. In the first part of its life, and it is ambulant, it gets around in the world, and you need a nervous system in order to respond to a changing environment. And having found a place to attach itself and then change its form, it finds itself now no longer in need of a nervous system, and so the nervous system goes as part of the metamorphosis. It doesn't actually eat it. The nervous systems are very costly parts of the body to maintain. Individual neurons consume more energy than most cells, and then neurons come together into clumps called ganglia, and those ganglia, as they get larger, we begin to think of them as brains. So if you don't need one, it might be wise not to have one. And when I speak of that, when I say that the general principles of movement are shared across the animal kingdom, I mean that quite literally. So the movement of jellyfish, who were the first animals to develop nervous systems and muscles, the movement of ants and millipedes and centipedes and humans and apes and bats and birds and fish, all have very, very simple principles, and they all depend, as we'll see, on the physics of oscillating bodies, things that go through simple cycles. But if we're speaking of all that, and we look at this wide variety of forms of movement, one question we might ask is, where is the wheel? Nature seems to be very, very good at coming up with all kinds of things. Where's the wheel in nature? Have you ever seen an animal that has a wheel? And humans have found wheels to be excellent engineering tools to construct all kinds of useful devices with. So why did nature never come up with one? Well, the answer is, it did. The wheel is found in nature. It's found at a very, very small scale, at the level of the individual bacterium. Some bacteria, like the E. coli bacterium, found in your gut, have a rotating disc. So a wheel is more than a disc. A wheel is a disc that rotates around an axle, and the axle stays fixed while the disc rotates. And that is the means of propulsion of an E. coli bacterium. Attached to the spinning disc are long flagellae, long whip-like appendages that propel the bacterium forward. The reason that we only find them at such a scale is that biological tissue has nutritional needs. It needs to be supplied with nutrients, and waste products need to be taken away. Once you get above a certain size, that requires cabling. It requires things like, well, we have blood vessels and lymph vessels. We have various pipes and conduits that supply things. The nervous system itself is a set of wires. At the very small level of an individual cell, processes of chemical diffusion are slow enough to supply these needs. But when you scale up, you would end up with a disc that cannot be supported because it has to spin freely around an axle. You can't have any wire or cable going into the wheel. And that's why they're not found at larger scales. Right. One very interesting pioneering study of movement in animals was done by a guy called Edward Muybridge. And you're familiar with many of his pictures. You've seen them all over the internet. He was working in the west coast of America in the late 19th century. He did some absolutely groundbreaking work, and his study of human and animal movement was cutting edge photography at the time. Edward Muybridge set up a studio with a fantastic array of cameras. Photography was very slow back then. You had to put in a plate and you had to expose the plate and then you had to change the plate. You couldn't do high-speed photography. So in order to have a sequence of exposures that would reveal the properties of movement, he needed to have multiple cameras that were set off by an elaborate series of tripwires. And so we get these kinds of images, which I know you've seen. And this particular one settled a point of dispute at the time as to whether a horse has all 4 feet off the ground when galloping. Muybridge is a terribly interesting character, and if you're ever bored, look up some YouTube documentaries on his life. Fascinating guy. Now, looking at those still photographs, you get a great sense of what a galloping horse is, but really we understand movement when it moves. So here's a bunch of dots, but now if you look at these dots moving, I think you'll see something other than a bunch of dots. So even though all that there was on screen there was a bunch of dots, you saw someone, a person, kicking and punching. That's how sensitive we are to the form of movement. So we recognize movement, and we recognize movement not just as something that's happening, but as goal-directed. And here's the link between movement and behavior again. When you were observing those dots moving, you were interpreting them in terms of purpose. You were saying this person is punching or kicking. Those are goal-directed activities. And we need to understand how the body comes together and moves in the service of a particular goal. Now, a lot of the perplexities that we encounter here come from employing inappropriate metaphors in our thinking. We often speak of control. In fact, there's a big field of motor control. And control is a problematic word. We probably overemphasize control when we come to the brain and the body. So when we walk, for example, the brain is playing an important role when we walk, as are the legs, as is the floor. If we naively simply say the brain controls the body and makes it walk, then we've made a sort of a logical error, because this is what is not going on in locomotion. The brain decides where the foot should go next, and the brain figures out which muscle combination will get it there, and the brain commands those muscles to move, and then the brain does make. This kind of explanation is common in school textbooks. It's common in everyday conversations, and we frequently mistake ourselves for our brains. But before we go any further with this topic, let's be quite clear. Brains are very important. They are organs of the body. They are made of meat, high cholesterol meat. They do not decide anything. A brain never decided. A brain never figured anything out. A brain never saw anything. Brains don't feel. Brains are not people. So in our everyday language, we freely swap those terms around. We say, oh no, my brain just can't take anymore. And my brain made me do this. And I had to fight with my brain. That's all imaginative talk. It's fine imaginative talk. When it comes to doing science in the area, it won't do. So let's be quite clear about that.